started with the preliminaries. Good evening. Nice crowd. Nice way to start the year. We're ready to go on what we hope is another interesting time. We are committed at the Historical Society to try to get you really interesting lectures. That's what we do, right? One of the things that you will see in the program, and there are copies of them in the back that is different from last year, is that it is somewhat more general, somewhat less Squirrel Hill specific than you may be used to. There are two reasons for that. One of them is, we've been here, this is our 5th cycle, and while we would bring certain subjects back, after a while we begin to run out of subjects that are purely Squirrel Hill. And we are committed to continuing to develop programs that have relevance to everyone here, but you will not see all the time quite as specific. One of the things I'm running into, we have been trying to get a lot of the merchants in the area to come and talk, and we will have Pamela's this year. But a lot of the merchants don't feel like they have enough to say. So I've been having, in terms of a history of their things. So they are the next logical group of institutions in Squirrel Hill that we haven't really focused on as much as we might. We work on it. The other reason you have a general program this year is that it is the 250th birthday of this city, and we're part of that, and we want to help celebrate. The program, you can read it. I want to just tell you a little about October, and then we'll go to our speaker. And by the way, I'm Mike Ehrman, and I'm chairman of the group. We're a volunteer group. There are membership cards in the back. If you join now, you'll be a member through 2008. You're welcome to these meetings, whether you're a member or not. We're here every second Tuesday night of the year, except for August. And next month, we have a speaker. None of us have met her. She volunteered to speak. Her name is Dr. Ellen Ross. She actually works on real estate relocation, but has developed a talk about what is right about Pittsburgh and our region that seems very appropriate to this year. And they were very anxious to come and have her talk. And she's not going to talk about her business. She's going to talk about her views of the region, including historic. So that will be in October. And this in November, Joel Tarr was a professor at at Carnegie, that many of our members have heard, wanted to have him come over. It happened that this year he's in the middle of issuing a book on the influence of horses on Pittsburgh. Talk about a different subject, and he's coming. And talking about a different subject, our speaker tonight, we're very happy, is Chris Potter, editor of the City Paper. Chris has been editor for a couple of years and been at the City Paper since '97. Did some teaching at Allegheny College in Meadville, and worked for In Pittsburgh, and that's what I know about Chris. And Chris has chosen a subject which we'll all understand better at the end, called Adventures in Presbyteria. This is a Presbyterian church. He thought that would be a good hook for the talk tonight, and we'll let him roll, and we'll see what we find out.
Thanks everybody for coming out. Thanks also to the Squirrel Hill Historical Society for having me, and for making a gift of this very fine book about Squirrel Hill's history. If you don't have a copy, get one. It's Squirrel Hill, published by the SHHS, as I like to call it the I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about Willa Cather, who is sort of an unsung figure here in Pittsburgh. A lot of people think of her as a prairie writer, sort of a chronicler of the West, but she lived here in Pittsburgh for about 10 years, and she lived in Squirrel Hill for about half of that period, not too far from here, at 1180 Murray Hill Avenue. The house still stands, and it's a handsome, I think, colonial revival is what I've been told by people who know best. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so. Then if I haven't bored you to tears by that point, I'll take a few questions, and if you don't have questions, then you can ask about the topic itself, or about the paper, or about our many fine advertisers, ad rates, should you want to place an ad. got a credit card machine in the back. I'm ready to do business. That's how I got to be where I am today. If I speak too fast, as I have a tendency to do, especially in front of lots of people, you can just do this, slow it down, slow it down. I also have a former student sitting in the back room from my teaching days at Allegheny who will do that. Still here, looking to get a better grade 2 years after I quit. So give her credit for tenacity, if nothing else. Let me just say right off the bat, I'm not a Willa Cather scholar. If you're looking for somebody who's going to talk about how the silhouette of the plow in my Antonia, silhouetted by the setting sun, represents the fusion of agriculture and nature, you can leave now and go to the Baroque people or enjoy the fine evening, because I'm not really going to go there. In fact, honestly, I read, I think, O Pioneers in college for a class, and was, to be honest with you, bored to tears by it. As a friend of mine in the class said, it's one thing to watch grass grow, it's another thing to read about it. And that's generally been my feeling about her until not so long ago. I just kind of started reading some of her shorter fiction. She wrote a handful of stories that were based, that she either wrote here while she was here or were based here, where the plot was centered here. And those, I think, are really incredibly interesting, and that's why I'm doing this talk about her. This title is, as Mike said, Adventures in Presbyteria. We'll talk about what Presbyteria is in a minute. The subtitle of the talk is, Once They've Seen the Bright Lights of Pittsburgh, How Are You Going to Get Them Back to Writing About the Farm? So let's jump right into it. I will say again that while I wasn't initially sort of a big fan of Cather's, I've come to sort of appreciate the fact, A, that she and I have a lot in common. We both obviously lived or have lived in Pittsburgh. We both worked in the media. Cather spent much of her career in Pittsburgh and outside of it working as a journalist. And as it turns out, there's a pretty good chance that we were both very, very fond of women. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. She was also, really in a way, although she only lived here for about 10 years, the quintessential Pittsburgh writer in many ways. For one thing, like a lot of us Pittsburghers, she is prone to nostalgia to the nth degree. Whenever you read a Willa Cather story, I don't care whether it's about life on the prairie or life in Pittsburgh, you're always getting nostalgic for something even if you don't know what it was. Everything was always better at some point in the distant past, which I think is sort of a Pittsburgh affliction as well. And she's also, her writing from Pittsburgh especially, as one of her chroniclers said, all of her writings that are from and about Pittsburgh are permeated with contemporary political and cultural controversies. You can really go back and you can look at the short stories that she wrote about Pittsburgh, and a lot of them, the plots, the ideas she got came right from the headlines of the newspaper she was working for, controversies that were going on. She wrote an article about the Chinese Boxer Rebellion, or a short story about the Boxer Rebellion, one of the lesser celebrated rebellions in Chinese history. That was based in part on reporting she had done in Pittsburgh's Chinatown. All of this stuff was in her writing, and as a result of that, she got into some issues that a lot of writers at that period, in the early 1900s, never even really thought of. She wrote a lot about urban sprawl. You know, it's a big issue for us now. You know, we think about these kind of suburbs just sprawling out to the horizons. Willa Cather was one of the first people to kind of really start to think about what that meant. She also did a lot of thinking about media celebrity culture and the dangers of media run wild, which is something I can speak to with some degree of authority, having perpetrated a few of those in my day. But she was fiercely interested in what was going on in Pittsburgh. She herself helped shape Pittsburgh a lot through articles in Pittsburgh, helped shape her. Finally, and I think in some ways most importantly, both in her stories and in her personal life, she set a tone for a story that's become really, really very common in Pittsburgh in the 20th century, which is, if you are a Pittsburgher and you want to be true to yourself, you have to get the hell out of Pittsburgh. Right? I mean, how many times have we sort of seen that story? The young people are running away, the young people are leaving. There are movies where the whole plot is, you know, I'm trying to grow up to be the person that I want to be, and because of that I have to choose between my blue-collar, hard-scrabble roots here in Pittsburgh, or I have to go to some better place out there and make a better life for myself. And of course, at the end of the movie, at the end of the book, they always leave. And Willa Cather was one of the first folks to leave in a fictional kind of way. Her story, Paul's Case, which we'll talk about a little bit, is really the first story where people started to wax hysterical that the young people were leaving. In the case of Paul, this fictional character, he throws himself in front of a train because he doesn't want to come back to Pittsburgh. Apparently making the decision that dying in Newark, New Jersey is preferable to living in Pittsburgh. I don't know. At any rate, her work also anticipates a lot of the urban redevelopment strategies that we see today. Even at least one movie I can think of starring Tom Cruise, all there in Willa Cather's work, just waiting decades into the future to be revealed by the creative genius that really is Tom Cruise. If Cather had written about, some teen starlet marrying into a Scientology cult, she'd have hit the trifecta. But although Cather herself left, and although leaving and getting out of Pittsburgh and the oppressiveness of Pittsburgh is so much a part of her work, I'm also going to finish the talk just by arguing that she really found herself in Pittsburgh to a large extent. And a lot of the things that are positive about Pittsburgh and that are easily overlooked, both within her writing and within our lives, is there in her work to be found and to be celebrated even today. Let me just talk briefly, give you a brief overview of the chronology of Willa Cather's life. I'll make it fast because this is dull. Born in Virginia in 1873 to parents Charles and Mary, when she was about 4 years old, her family moved to Red Cloud, Nebraska, where she's always been associated with ever since. And as she grew up, one of the things that, one of the things that people notice about her right now, incredibly intelligent, also incredibly ambitious. She wrote for her high school newspaper, she wrote for her college newspaper, and I can tell you how rare that is to get somebody to do those things. And she was also incredibly ambitious. And that ambition took some strange forms. We think of Cather now because she wrote about these prairies as this sort of, dusty and fusty and musty kind of schoolmarmish type person who, write conventional farm narratives. But I'll tell you what, in her adolescence, this woman did an amount of gender bending that Andy Warhol himself would have envied. When she was a teenager, she aspired to be a surgeon, which, believe it or not, in the late 19th century, a male-dominated field. And so one of the things she did to pursue this interest was she started dressing up like a guy. She would call herself Dr. William Cather, or William Cather Jr. She would play male parts in plays, and generally do anything that she could to try and pass as a male, at least as a sort of adolescent kind of game for herself. For Cather, throughout her life, sort of playing with those gender roles was really the instrument to really expressing herself as a person, even in the sense of having career freedom. For her, it was because women's roles in that period of time, as to some extent today, were so narrowly defined that in some ways the only way she could get out of that trap was to really just kind of kick them in the butt and try and get out of the rut and do things like dress up as a guy when she was in high school. Goes off to school, University of Nebraska, works at some state papers, does the journalism trick until in 1896 she gets a job at Pittsburgh, working as the editor of the late and not terribly lamented Home Monthly, which I'm happy to say was an attempt to compete with the Ladies' Home Journal, which I don't know about you folks, but I read religiously. She was hired as the editor, and she ended up writing most of the stories herself, especially in her first couple months there. The guy who hired her basically hired her and then took a vacation really before her first issue came out, which I can totally respect as a manager myself. She ended up writing a ton of the stories, often under assumed names, and it was not easy stuff for her to write. You can imagine somebody who had aspired to be a surgeon, dressed up as a boy, as a kid, writing sentences like this, and this is a Willa Cather line, writing about President William McKinley's life. For the last 25 years, Mrs. McKinley's life and interests have been those of her husband, as in one way or another, actively or passively, every woman's must be. It's a touching sentiment, isn't it? God, for those days again. So she could play the game, right? But there was also a sort of waspishness about her and a willingness to sort of take on more. I'm going to read to you, this is for local folks. She was capable of writing really incredibly mean-spirited things about people and really kind of playing around with people's expectations. She wrote music reviews from the time she was in high school, theater reviews and things like that. And she wrote this one musical review, although she was here in Pittsburgh at the time. She was still writing for papers back in Nebraska, and one of the pieces she wrote mentioned the wife of George Westinghouse, the guy with Westinghouse Breaker and all that stuff. So she's talking about this review, the Andante was a little blah, 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 and then she says, and here I must digress upon the famous Mrs. George Washington Jr., never forget the Jr., Everyone knows that George Westinghouse is the foremost manufacturer of electrical apparatus in America, but Mrs. George, when he married her, was not exactly a reputable person. She now looks like a circus rider well along the downgrade. Although, yeah, it gets worse. Although money is potent, Presbyterian Pittsburgh still draws the line on a few things, and it drew a large black line on Mrs. George Westinghouse, Jr. Her servant girl physiognomy did not so help her, and she had her hair, well, treated with sea baths, as we say in Nebraska. Once upon a time, some generous woman invited her to a reception, and Mrs. George took a boy in buttons along to hold up her train and entered the drawing room like a princess, back when princesses did such things. One of the guests laughed, and after that, Mrs. Westinghouse took the smoke of Pittsburgh out of her peroxide tresses and dwelt haughtily apart in Massachusetts. Their magnificent residence in Pittsburgh is called solitude, and very fittingly so, for she only deigns to visit her liege lord once every few years on state occasions. It's important to remember, she wrote this for a paper in Nebraska, so there's a good chance that neither Mrs. George Westinghouse nor anybody else in Pittsburgh ever saw it. She could be a bit of a nasty piece of work. But she also made some really important friends in Pittsburgh, and she was able to really play that game and play with the elite of the city. One of her friends helped land her first job at the Pittsburgh Theatre. His name was Ethelbert Nevin, whose name I love. And his family was also the basis for several characters in one of her Pittsburgh short stories, which is called Uncle Valentine. I'll talk about that in a second. One reason I love the name Ethelbert Nevin, there were a ton of Nevins, apparently. They were all fairly wealthy and fairly prosperous and influential in the community. So much so that the minister at their church was said to begin the Lord's Prayer with the invocation, Our Father, which art a Nevin. There's really no other reason to mention Ethelbert Nevin, except I think that's funny. So after a couple of years, the Home Monthly went out of business, and so Cather took a job working for the Pittsburgh Leader. And she didn't do much in the way of actual reporting. She basically was sort of a telegraph editor. The Telegraph would come in and she would format stories for the paper. And she quickly acquired a kind of disdain for journalism that only those of us who practice it can really get. Just to give you a couple of quick quotes from her career, this is, remember, her job. Cather said, no matter how hard you work on a story, it's only last week's paper and fit for wrapping our shoes. She also said, the great American newspaper takes an intellect, promised talent, it gives out only gossip. It is written for machines, set by machines, and read by machines. A newspaper writer should have no more individuality than those clicking iron machines that set the type. God, I'd love to have some more of that attitude in my staff. So she wrote for the paper, not crazy about it, we'll talk about some reasons why in the future, but perhaps the most pivotal, certainly the most pivotal experience in her life here in Pittsburgh, and perhaps in her entire life, came in 1899 when she met Isabel Mcclung. And it was Isabel whose family lived just up the street on Murray Hill Avenue. And they quickly became very close friends. I mean, real close friends. They took trips together to Europe, to New York. They hung out together all the time. One of their friends described their life together this way. They're living in Isabel's home. Isabel's parents took this stranger in, essentially allowed her to live with them for about 5 years. They took her in, and a mutual friend of Isabel and Willa says, the two young women would forsake the family group soon after dinner, and evening after evening would go upstairs to the bedroom they shared to read together in quiet. Those women love to read. And read. And read. At any rate, shortly after that, Cather took a job teaching at the Pittsburgh schools, taught at a couple of them, had her first two books, a collection of short stories which she dedicated to Isabel Mcclung, and a book of poetry. Started writing the books that would make her famous, O Pioneers especially. She wrote major chunks of here in Pittsburgh, just a few blocks from here. And in 1906, basically moved to New York City to work for McClure's magazine, which published her story, Paul's Case, which we'll talk about. Lived in New York with her partner Edith Lewis. They lived in Greenwich Village, although they didn't really do any of the Greenwich Village things, they basically kept to themselves. Lived in New York, basically won a lot of awards, traveled around, was famous, died in 1947 from a cerebral hemorrhage. What attracted Willa to Pittsburgh? Obviously the job, the chance to get out of Red Cloud, Nebraska, which I think we can all have some sympathy with, especially if you lived in Meadville, as at least 2 people in this room have done. And Pittsburgh, it's hard for us to remember now, was the big city back then. We're talking 300,000 people, which in 1900 wasn't half bad. And when Cather herself came here, she was struck by, as every visitor was, certainly, by the rivers of flame, the skies filled with smoke. She said the entire city seemed lit by the very incandescence of human energy. The air itself, she felt, possessed a feverish, passionate endeavor. Actually, of course, the air itself really possessed nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and all that other sort of stuff. And it didn't take long for Willa to start to feel a bit oppressed by Pittsburgh. This is a tough town, as we all know. The sky was gray, the people were even grayer. And she talks about the sort of psychological, more than as we'll see, more than the environmental problems, more than the poverty, more than the hard work of the average steelworker. What really sort of got her down was the psychological oppressiveness of it. This is a little selection from her novella, Uncle Valentine. And in Uncle Valentine, it's told from the perspective of a child who's remembering her uncle, who's this sort of very vivacious, gifted, brilliant composer and musician. And he comes back from being abroad in Europe, and he and the narrator's aunt go into the city together. They live out in Sewickley. And they go in the city together to go do Christmas shopping. And here's how the child sort of imagines the 2 of them in the city. All the men they passed in the street were so slow and ponderous, or when they weren't ponderous, stiff. Stiff because they were wooden, or because they weren't wooden and were in constant dread of betraying the fact. Up there in the city, nobody was free. They were imprisoned in their harsh Calvinism, or in their merciless business grind, or in mere apathy, a mortal dullness. I could see those 2 walking about the narrow streets of the grim, raw, dark, gray old city, cold with its river damp, and severe by reason of the brooding frown of huge stone churches that loomed up, even in the most congested part of the shopping district. There were old graveyards around those churches with gravestones, sunken and tilted and blackened, covered this morning with dirty snow, and the jangling car lines all around them. The street lamps would be burning all day on account of the fog. Hidden away in the grime and damp and noise were the half-dozen special shops which imported splendors for the owners of those mills that made the city so dark and so powerful. If you're like me, and maybe like Willa Cather, you find yourself getting a little nostalgic for the jangling car lines and the good old trolleys of Pittsburgh, you probably also know exactly the graveyard she's talking about on 6th Avenue in downtown Pittsburgh, right by First Trinity, the oldest graveyard in the city of Pittsburgh, really. But note in that passage how what's really oppressive, it's not the factories, it's not the steel mills, it's the churches that bear down on the people. The mills are somewhere off in the distance, just sort of disgorging smoke and everything. It's really the churches and the Calvinism of the people who live and work there. Cather never really does sort of write a hell with the lid off kind of image for us, but what she does create is this kind of psychologically oppressive environment. And that's the environment that Cather was most sensitive to. Her Uncle Valentine, his very name, obviously suggests sort of playful emotion and childhood infatuation and things like that, thrust into the harsh Calvinism of the city, really sort of summarizes the way Cather saw Pittsburgh. Cather herself once wrote, and this is the line from which the title of this talk is taken, all of Pittsburgh is divided into 2 parts, Presbyteria and Bohemia, and the former is larger and the more influential kingdom of the 2. Presbyteria, obviously, is easy to define. It's that sort of Scots-Irish mercantile Protestantism, or Protestant mercantilism, depending on what your priorities are, that defined not just the business leaders like Carnegie and Frick and those guys and the Mellons, but all of the middle-level managers and everybody else in town. To Cather, these were sort of the figures that made the city as oppressive as it was. Cather once said, "There's nothing on earth that a Pittsburgh Presbyterian fears and hates as he does human emotion." She said the only public gathering that a Pittsburgh Presbyterian would feel comfortable at was a funeral. Presumably not his own, but still, a funeral. Bohemia, on the other hand, was the opposite principle. It was a world of artists, like herself and her friends, naturally. It was also a realm of pure feeling, uninhibited, the kingdom of art, the land of unrestrained emotions. Throughout all of this, you'll see that if you read her stuff, especially her Pittsburgh stuff, you'll see that she never really, just because she hates the wealthy industrialists doesn't mean she really identifies very strongly with the workers. You don't get a sense that, Willa Cather's out there up on the ramparts, demanding revolution now or any of that sort of stuff. She tends to side with middle class and upper class bohemians who have enough money and comfort to sort of be at arm's distance from the poverty, but then also to sort of entertain a noblesse oblige. They can also stay apart from those cold, grasping merchants that describe Pittsburgh. On the other hand, one would like to sort of see somebody taking a more direct interest in the lives of working people who suffer more, certainly than Uncle Valentine or any of the other fairly well-off characters in her books. On the other hand, Cather did see very early on the environmental despoliation being caused and the sort of psychological trauma that the environment did to folks. She talked about, just again from Uncle Valentine, she talks about looking from their house in Sewickley. We could look over all the great wrinkles of the hills, catch glimpses of the river, and see the black pillar of cloud to the north where the city lay. This dark cloud, as evening came on, took deep, rich colors from the sunset, and after the sun was gone, it sent out all night an orange glow from the furnace fires that burned there. But that smoke did not come down to us. Our evenings were pure and silvery, soft blue skies seen through the budding trees above us, over the folds and folds of lavender forest below. So you get the sense that these folks are really camped almost on the front doorstep of hell, right? Just over that next hillside, over that next river, the city was burning and consuming lives, all that sort of good Allen Ginsberg poetry type stuff. At the end of Uncle Valentine, of course, what we discover is there's really no way to separate yourself from that kind of hellish experience. At the end of Uncle Valentine, the narrator leaves. She comes back years later and finds that all of their wonderful homes have been torn down during the Second World War. And as the narrator puts it, the wave of industrial expansion swept down that valley, and roaring mills belched their black smoke up to the heights where those lovely houses used to stand. So again, we see that even the wealthy cannot be separated from the very environmental sort of holocaust that they really perpetrated on everybody else. But Cather also saw as part of that, not just the environmental problems, but also sort of the psychological problems. For her, a big part of it, long before we ever saw her Joni Mitchell talking about paving over paradise and putting up a parking lot, Cather was warning about what we were losing by sort of going out into the suburbs. Cather once said, "Quick transportation is the death of art," which I think is a sort of fascinating idea to play with. And her idea was that suburbs, because they isolate people physically, isolate them emotionally. We turn away from each other. We're not as closely compacted together. We have these lawns separating us. Every kingdom, every person's home is a castle or whatever, and we pull up our drawbridges and we separate ourselves by moats of grass. And another story that she wrote that's often paired with Uncle Valentine, Double Birthday, is really about that idea. Suburb versus city, Presbyteria versus Bohemia. Of course, back when she wrote it, the suburb in question was, I'm sorry to say, none other than Squirrel Hill. You're now going to hear what a horrible place Squirrel Hill was, psychologically and spiritually. Double Birthday is about two families who once lived together in the sort of same kind of village, which was what we now call the North Side, and was at that time the city of Allegheny. And for reasons we'll get to in a second, Cather really saw Allegheny as being this sort of idyllic village. It was the place where Bohemia and Presbyteria could kind of exist side by side. You could kind of embody both of those things without surrendering either. As Allegheny sort of falls into ruin, one family goes up, and that's the family of Judge Hammersley and his daughter, and another family goes down. But the family that goes down still, they're poor but proud. They have their dignity. They live in a little workers' hovel in the south side, but somehow they manage to have like a baby grand piano and some really nice art up on the walls. It's never exactly clear how they're able to hold on to this stuff. But by comparison, the judge's house is this cold, sterile place. And here's how she describes it. This is Albert, who lives in the poor but proud folks over in the south side, visiting the judge. Albert got off at the foot of one of the streets running up Squirrel Hill. He knew all the places. Old school friends lived in many of them. Big turreted stone houses set in ample grounds with fine trees and shrubbery and driveways. Gosh, that sounds nice. If the occupants had recognized Albert, they would have felt sorry for him. but he did not feel sorry for himself. He looked up at the lighted windows and shrugged. His old schoolfellows went to New York now as often as he had done in his youth. But they went to consult doctors, to put children into school, or to pay the bills of incorrigible sons. This solid comfort, this iron-bound security, didn't appeal to him much. These massive houses, after all, held nothing but the heavy domestic routine, all the frictions and jealousies and discontents of family life. Nice picture, huh? He wouldn't at this moment exchange his life and his memories for any of these massive houses and the lives of the men who paid the upkeep. This is Cather's voice. Bear in mind, this is a woman who never got married, lived to the end of her days either in boarding houses or in the company of other women, talking about the frictions and jealousies and discontents of family life. No interest in it whatsoever. But it goes a little deeper than that. Remember I said this house belonged to a judge, Judge Hammersley, who's sort of, to the extent that there's a villain in this story, it's Judge Hammersley. Well, as you remember, Cather is living in the home of Isabel Mcclung. Anybody want to guess what Isabel's father did for a living? He was a judge. Not only was he a judge, but he was a judge who, as a common police court judge, ruled on a case in which the city of Allegheny tried to prevent Pittsburgh from acquiring it. They basically contested the legal mechanism by which Pittsburgh acquired it. So in a way, she's setting up this idyllic paradise which the judge in the story is opposed to, and the judge whose house she was living in helped to destroy. Okay, you get the feeling there might have been a little tension around the dinner table in the McClung family household. She's living there, but she can't really be with the person she wants to be with. And Cather was the sort of person, as we saw with the piece, her writing on Mrs. Washington, who was willing to use her writing to settle some scores like this. Supposedly when Uncle Valentine came out, a lot of people who lived in Sewickley were really ticked off at her because she had sort of very thinly and vaguely sort of concealed who was who, and they could sort of recognize themselves in their portrayals, and they didn't find them to be terribly flattering. It's not clear, incidentally, how much friction there really was in the household. Accounts differ. Generally, Cather was not the type who would make a scene, especially when they were paying her rent and keeping her dry in the rain. However, there are stories that, for example, when Isabel came to her parents and said, "Can we have this person move in with us?" her parents said, no. And she said, "Well, then I'm going to move out." And there was a big row about it, and finally they relented and let Cather in. There's some evidence to that, but for the most part, it seems like once she was in, things were more or less, at least on the surface, okay. Even so, you can imagine that for Cather, it was a difficult situation to be with this woman who she loved. She incidentally dedicated 2 of her books to Isabel Mcclung, and told her friends that as far as she was concerned, Isabel Mcclung was the inspiration for every book she ever wrote. When Isabel died years later, and this is perhaps the most poignant part of this whole thing, Willa got her letters back, the letters that they had exchanged, and every Sunday she would read some of the letters and then have Edith Lewis, her partner, destroy them. So there's almost no correspondence remaining from her relationship with Isabel Mcclung. To me, I mean, the silence that results from that is as poignant as any of their words actually could have been, that she went to that trouble. So not surprisingly, one finds Willa Cather find just a little bit oppressive living in Pittsburgh. And she said, and this is sort of a famous quote that people who want to beat up on Pittsburgh like to dredge out, "Anyone who has not lived here cannot realize how incongruous, how little short of miserable it is for an artist to come out of Pittsburgh." Sentiments that Andy Warhol might well have shared from time to time, August Wilson as well. And it brings us to Paul's case, the story that I think most speaks to who Willa Cather was and to what Pittsburgh was at the time. Paul's case, her most famous short story, and obviously the one she cared about the most. One reason people know it is because Willa herself wanted it anthologized in all of the anthologies of her work. She really pushed for it to be in there. She cared about the story a lot, and we'll see that it spoke to her in a lot of ways. But if people have read Paul's case or not, I don't know. The plot isn't hard to do. Paul is a high school kid who's an oddball, a misfit. There's a suggestion of some sexual ambiguity on his part, but mainly he just can't get along with people and they can't get along with him. He shows off all the time. He makes a big show of disrespecting his teachers. He's always showing off, but he doesn't have any friends to show off for. The only place Paul feels at home, it's certainly not at his house. He's got a middle-class home, but he hates it. It's as oppressive as if he lived in some row house down in the bottoms of Homestead and down in the ward. Not happy there. The only place that he's happy is in the theater, where he works as an usher. And the theater in question is the Carnegie Music Hall in Oakland, described perfectly. And this is the description of the theater and what it means to him. It's perhaps the most important section of this entire story. It would be difficult to put it strongly enough how convincingly the stage entrance of that theater was for Paul the actual portal of romance. In the midst of that smoke-palled city, enamored of figures and grimy toil, Paul had his secret temple, his wishing carpet, his bit of blue and white Mediterranean shore bathed in perpetual sunshine. This too would have been true of Cather, for whom Pittsburgh's cultural blandishments were about the only compensation other than Isabel for living here. Paul moons about for a while. Basically, his father finally gets ticked off at him, tells him to get out of the theater, get a real job. Paul honors that request by getting a job and then stealing a couple $1,000 from his employers, jumping on a train, heading out to New York City, where he goes and takes a room in the Waldorf Hotel, spends a lot of time drinking champagne, getting silly, until it looks like the money is going to run out. He spends his time basically not talking to anybody, just drinking champagne and watching the passing parade. Until finally, he picks up the papers from Pittsburgh and realizes that, well, his father's looking for him, surprisingly enough. Could have seen that coming. And he's been spotted in New York. And the money's going to run out sooner or later, so it's time for Paul to go. So Paul, as I said before, instead of riding a train to New York, rides a train to Newark, New Jersey, wanders outside of Newark, throws himself in front of the train, and dies, and that's the end of the story. Being sort of the dark example of Pittsburgh not being able to hold on to its young people. Cather herself followed Paul's example. The year after this story came out in 1905, she left Pittsburgh, moved to New York in 1906 to work for, in fact, McClure's, the magazine that printed Paul's story. Obviously didn't throw herself in front of a train, so in that sense it worked out pretty well. But the reasonable suspicion is that for her, like Paul, life in Pittsburgh had become too oppressive for her to stay and remain true to herself. In some ways, I'd suggest this story is at least 50 years ahead of its time. It anticipates Andy Warhol's departure. Warhol, once he left Pittsburgh, he'd come back to visit his mom or whatever, but he would constantly lie about where he was from. He'd tell people he was from McKeesport, which I don't know why that would be a step in, why that's any better. I mean, it's sort of like, do you throw yourself in front of a train in Newark, or do you tell people you're from McKeesport, or you just fess up and go back to Pittsburgh? I'm not sure why it's such a horrible option, but it's one a lot of people took. And of course, it's also become a really common trope in a lot of films and books that are set in Pittsburgh. I don't know if anybody's seen Tom Cruise's All the Right Moves, story about a kid in a town more or less like Johnstown, but very similar to Pittsburgh, has a chance to leave his town, go pursue a football scholarship, as I recall. All he's got to do is put behind him his working class ties. Guess what Tom does? Dominic and Eugene, don't know if anybody's seen that story, also set in Pittsburgh. An incredibly bizarre story. So here's Dominic and Eugene. The older brother is brilliant. The younger brother is a little slow. The older brother could become a doctor, but he has to leave Pittsburgh to become a doctor. I guess like UPMC wasn't advertising often enough. Or if they just had that sign up on top of USX Tower, maybe he would really, hey, I can be a doctor and not have to leave at all. But Dominic and Eugene, the guy has to leave. Even Michael Chabon's debut novel, The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, follows a very similar track to Paul's case. Once again, we have a son estranged from his father, and estranged from his father's life of outward respectability. In Mysteries of Pittsburgh, his father's actually a mobster, but on the surface, he's a great guy. So in Presbyteria, that's all that really counts. Also, the character of that book struggling with his own sexual identity, and basically at the end of it decides the only way he can be true to himself is to get the hell out of Dodge. And he leaves Pittsburgh, presumably never to return. Most of all, though, I'm going to suggest, the story conforms to that sense that we have in Pittsburgh of ourselves. We've been worried about young people leaving in Pittsburgh since I was a young person myself. And of course, that's getting longer and longer ago with every passing minute I stand up here. Most of us, of course, if we leave, don't throw ourselves in front of trains. Regrettably, some of us, do become Dallas Cowboy fans. But generally, while we still express nostalgia again for Pittsburgh, not a lot of us come back. And what's really interesting is that we agonize over it. We agonize over it when we don't have to. Let's bear in mind, take a step back. This is a college town. Young people are going to leave. That's what happens in college towns. I lived in Meadville. We all left. We had a great 4 years there, but there wasn't a lot going on in Meadville. I got a student back there who's headed to Houston, for crying out loud. And if that's not a tragedy, I don't know what is. But we still blame ourselves for this. It tells us some horrible story that we somehow need to believe about ourselves, that there's something so fundamentally wrong with Pittsburgh, so hostile to who we're supposed to be, that we just can't stay here. And if you do stay here, there's something kind of half-assed about it, right? That is, in a way, the part of Paul's case, I think, that sort of speaks to and for and about sort of Pittsburgh mentality. But I want to say that there's another side to it, which is Willa Cather did live here for 10 years. The great love of her life, she met here. She discovered herself as a writer here in Pittsburgh. When she came here, she'd written only the sort of most fleeting and vague attempts at literature, and by the time she left, she had written one of the finest short stories, I would argue, of the 20th century, which was Paul's Case. She had written the bulk of O Pioneers, as I mentioned before. And yet somehow we don't really recognize her as one of our own. There's something about Pittsburgh that if you were born here, you kind of count, even if you got out of here at the first available opportunity and never came back. Whereas if you chose to come here, stuck around for 10 years, and then left, it's like people who moved down the street from you. They've only lived there 40 years, so really they're kind of newcomers in town. I mean, that's like that sort of Pittsburgh mentality. In a way, I think Cather gets caught up in that. Yeah, she had hard words for Pittsburgh, but let's remember the important thing about Willa Cather. The most important thing in Pittsburgh, the most important love she had in Pittsburgh was the one thing she couldn't talk about. She could never talk publicly about the thing that mattered most to her here. So obviously we're going to get this kind of one-sided perspective of the city from her and of her perspective and of the life she had in the city. But Pittsburgh was the big city for her. Paul's case derives from the thing that happened in the city of Pittsburgh itself. Two 19-year-old kids basically got bored, decided to rob the place they worked for. They ran off to Chicago and then to Milwaukee, presumably because they thought nobody would look for them in Milwaukee. Probably people in Milwaukee would run to Pittsburgh, assuming nobody would ever look for them here. And they later explained when they finally got caught that they'd been longing to know how it would feel to have enough money to have just as good a time as a boy could want to have. That was what they told the police and the reporters. They were, in some ways, just out to have a good time, and yet Cather saw in them sort of her own yearning. And I'm just going to suggest that that yearning and that desire is a key part of what made her writing what it was and so good, and what makes living in Pittsburgh so good. We sort of fight against it, but that struggle is a part of us. I'm going to mention a final passage from a story and then kind of wrap it up here. One of her lesser-known stories is called The Professors Commencement. And it's about a high school teacher who's basically wrapping up his career, and he's kind of wondering whether his whole life has not been a total waste of time. And he's sort of sitting there in his classroom, and he looks out over the city below, and he thinks about what his job has been. Nominally, he'd been a teacher of English literature, but his real work had been to try and secure for youth the rights of youth. The right to be generous, to dream, to enjoy, to feel a little seduction of the old romance, and to yield to it just a little. His students, though, were boys and girls from the factories and office, designed to return to them, and hypnotized by the glitter of yellow metal. They were practical, unimaginative, and mercenary at 16. Presbyterians through and through, huh? And yet he tells his sister, his older sister, who says, your life's basically been a waste, you've been chasing something that doesn't really matter. He says, any work that's been done here for aesthetics cannot be lost. I suppose we shall win in the end, but the reign of mammon has been long and oppressive. The other side never sleeps. In the theaters, in the newspapers, those damn newspapers again, in the mills, in the offices, in the coal fields. A somewhat despairing and yet hopeful message at the same time. But in the end, aesthetics did win, right? I mean, look at the city now. If Willa Cather came back, she wouldn't even recognize the place. Of course, it wasn't because we had this spiritual enlightenment. We didn't outgrow our greed or capitalism. Greed and capitalism outgrew us. It's shipped off the factories to Japan or to Brazil or whatever else. And yet we still have this place that Cather herself probably could have celebrated. And to a large extent, Bohemia beat Presbyteria. I was reading a book the other day about the history of Pittsburgh Theatre, and this 1936 statement by the Pittsburgh Playhouse just struck me. This is 30 years after Paul's case. Sometimes we think Pittsburgh is a town of immaturity and arrested development, living on its past. They were already worried about this in 1936. It's a city doing little for the present, having precious few men caring for the future. But we have the beginning of one resource, the Pittsburgh Playhouse. Will we develop that resource, or just go Pittsburghian and let it drag along until it finally dies of anemia? Go Pittsburghian. I mean, note again the presence of nostalgia here. We're learning back for 40 years ago, and 40 years ago they were learning back for 40 years before that. But also notice, 30 years after Paul's case. Paul's case was written at a time when Paul would have been told by the ruling elite, you're immature, you got to grow up, you got to stop spending so much time in that theater. Now, 30 years later, we've got some of the leading figures of Pittsburgh saying, you people got to grow up, you got to spend more time in that theater. Art and theater have become, and we see it with the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust and all this other stuff that's going on in the city right now, they've become economic development tools. The values of Bohemia have in some way become melded with the values of Presbyteria in a way that Cather herself, I don't know, would have necessarily loved, but would certainly have been intrigued by. There's even a guy, Richard Florida, who some of you may have heard of, a former professor of CMU, who's argued that cities, if they're going to succeed, need to attract creative people and to be tolerant of gays and lesbians and folks of all manner of sexual orientations and identities. Florida, interestingly enough, created a way of ranking cities, and it's called the Bohemian Index, which sort of ranks a city's embracement of a degree of support for the arts, its tolerance of people of different sexual orientations. The Bohemian Index, I mean, you may as well be saying, the Cather Index or something like that. So in other words, we're fusing these things together in a way that I think Cather could not possibly have anticipated. There are still challenges, of course. As Cather pointed out, the challenge of suburban sprawl, I think, remains a problem. I mean, it's hard to think of going back to a time when Squirrel Hill would have been the suburb, right? I mean, it's pretty, I hope you all feel a little not so good about yourselves when you sneer at Mount Lebanon now. Because it was once you, my friends. It's hard to imagine ever going back to that. And it's equally hard to imagine any simple solution to some of the challenges that Cather faced 100 years ago. It was not easy for a woman to be an editor of a magazine. She basically was able to do a lot of what she did because she had a lazy boss. Again, the power of a lazy boss in media. I'm wholeheartedly supportive of it myself. But we're still trying to catch up with these. I have a friend who's an economist who will say Pittsburgh's steel industry, just by the way the stresses it put on families, steelworkers' families, essentially prevented women from entering the workforce in any kind of meaningful way until really the past 10 or 20 years. We've got almost a century of social progress when it comes to gender equity to make up in this town. And you can see the signs of it happening, but there's a long way to go. And yet, I submit to you that the fact that Cather came here under much less advantageous circumstances than we have here is a sign of hope for all of us as well. Where this country and this city have come in terms of tolerance of sexual orientation in my lifetime alone is an astounding sign of hope. And I think, too, we have the potential to finally get past this sort of false notion of the young people leaving. I have a good friend who says, Pittsburgh always worries about losing its young people. We got to think about ourselves in terms of launching our young people out into something that they want to go and do. This is what college towns do. We launch people out into the world. We launch artists out into the world. And yeah, there are problems in this town, but on some level, those problems, I'm going to go invoke Paradise Lost. John Milton, I am an English major, I have to do this at least once. The whole notion of Paradise Lost, once we fell from that state of grace, that's when things got interesting for humanity. Because now we could choose whether to be good or to be evil. And the struggles that we had to participate in just to be human beings became what defined us and made us, the angels that we potentially can all be. And I would say that Cather as well, if she didn't have Presbyteria to react against, she never could have had a Bohemia to yearn for. And in some ways, the very things that make Pittsburgh so difficult for all of us today are exactly the struggle that we need to own and to celebrate in ourselves. Because, frankly, we could be living off the fat of the land out there in Seattle with all the other sake latte drinkers. But for us, it's got to come a much easier, it's got to come a much harder, more honest, and I would argue more lasting way. I went long, and I appreciate your patience. If you've got questions or whatever, I'm happy to speak to you further. Thank you. Ms. Krzyzicki.
Chris, do you have any idea when she went to New York? Why did Isabel go with her?
Right.
What happened to that relationship?
Well, what happened to the relationship, interestingly, was a few years later, Isabel got married to a violinist, and Willa took it hard. She took it real hard. And in fact, it had a really deleterious effect on her writing. The guy that Isabel married was a Jewish violinist, and unfortunately, some of the villains that cropped up in Willa's stories tended to be on the anti-Semitic caricature side. She worked through that fairly quickly, honestly, and she and the husband did become friends. And in fact, it was the husband who returned her correspondence after Isabel died. He did that for her. She dedicated a book to him as well later in life as a gesture. So yeah, I mean, I think for Isabel, Isabel Isabel had a foot much more firmly planted in the camp of convention and tradition in a way that Willa never did. And in fact, to a large extent, it's interesting, Isabel, when Willa came to Pittsburgh, she tried to dress very severely, not in the sort of feminine mode of the time. Isabel, on the other hand, tended to dress in a much more conventionally feminine way. And as a result of their association, Willa's outfit and her whole approach to wardrobe tended to change as well. And in fact, she would write in some of her stories about how her characters would dress up and sort of feel like in some way they were arming themselves. It wasn't who they really were, but it was their armor to sort of shield the person and to sort of choose their identity. So I think, it's hard to say without having any of those letters what the exact sort of disjunction was, but it seems pretty clear from how things played out that Isabel was never going to defy all of those conventions as openly as Willa was apparently going to do.
What was his name?
I can't remember. It's I've got it in my bag, but it's like like Hermanson or something like that. He was a European, I think from the Netherlands.
Did Willa Cather have a relationship with Sarah Stewart? And why was she buried in Valentine?
I honestly, you weren't here for the first part of this when I said I'm not a Willa Cather scholar. My interest was really specifically as I did this stuff. I mean, I can't really, her Pittsburgh connections were really what I was.
I think she has a relationship with Sarah Stewart.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't really speak to the burial and stuff like that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Chris, can you ascertain, without being a scholar, whether she was happier or less happy in the later phases of her life than the one here?
I would say, it's tricky. Probably less. My sense, just from some of the reading that I've done, from sort of secondhand accounts of people who knew her, a little less tormented, probably a little less of the extremes or whatever. She did basically live a very quiet life. Surprisingly, she was living in Greenwich Village for much of her life post-Pittsburgh, which you would think, wow, Bohemia Central, right? But she actually lived a very quiet life. I mean, it seems like you could take the girl out of Presbyteria, but you couldn't quite take Presbyteria out the girl. She herself, in a way, I think had sort of managed to fuse that Presbyterian Bohemia within herself to the extent that she's able to sort of choose to be with Edith Lewis if that's what she wanted to do, but didn't feel as she had felt when she was an adolescent a need to flaunt this stuff in the same kind of way, which she had very much been about in Nebraska. Of course, it's pretty easy to flaunt difference in Nebraska, from what I understand. Other questions?
Did she ever go back west?
Yeah, and in fact, she traveled quite a bit. She did permanently, like for a long period of time, no. She did go back to visit. She came back to Pittsburgh on several occasions. In fact, one of her younger brothers went to school here, and she helped settle him in. She came back to Pittsburgh, gave talks and things like that.
She lived in New Mexico also.
Okay, is that right? Okay. But didn't seem to, as far as Pittsburgh went, which again is where my focus was, no hard feelings per se. It's not like she, renounced the place and never wanted to set foot inside it again, which I think is also sort of interesting and suggests that, for all of her when you kind of weigh that against the horrible things she said about it, and I only gave you a sampling, of some of her fiction, the fact that she was willing to come back and to speak about, speak to folks was impressive. Yeah.
Her wilderness book still in circulation.
Very much so. I mean, I know that Carnegie's got a bunch of copies. You can certainly find O Pioneers and all that stuff. It's a little easier to find My Antonia and O Pioneers and some of that stuff, in my experience, than it is to find some of the short story stuff. But I've never had any trouble finding short
The
story.
Library of America has 2 volumes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Didn't she live on the north side?
She moved around before she lived in Squirrel Hill. She lived, I think, mostly in East Liberty, in a series of boarding houses, and she taught in Allegheny as well. So yeah, she kind of bipped around a little bit. But most of the whole second half of her decade here she spent.
I was curious, back in Willa Cather's Pittsburgh, you said most of Pittsburgh is Presbyteria. You made a mention of Allegheny City was kind of a good, split between the two. What was sort of the capital of Bohemia back then?
That's interesting. I would say, first of all, I think her argument was that Presbyteria, not that most of it was Presbyteria, but that Presbyteria was where the real power was. I mean, obviously, if you looked at the demographic makeup of the city, I doubt most people were Presbyterian, but if you really looked at the elite, she certainly, interestingly for her, the Bohemia that she dealt with mostly, a lot of it was centered in Sewickley, and here in which, yeah, I know, I realize those wild and crazy guys in Sewickley. But I think that's sort of it's sort of an interesting thing about her sort of class privilege in a way, was that for her that was it. Yet, it was never, as is still the case today, I don't think there was never kind of a Greenwich Village that she seemed a kind of demi-monde or whatever that she hung out with. It tended to be an association, a network of friends. In fact, I mentioned the South Side where the book Double Birthday is set. There's the apartment there is really based very strongly on 2 very close friends of hers, the Siebels, who were very much kind of her idea of the kind of Bohemia that she was about. They were in many ways very aesthetically interested people with an interest in literature, music, and everything else. So I don't think she traveled in a pretty rarefied circle. You'll see a lot of that too in the way she approached sort of the Boxer Rebellion. There was a huge debate in Pittsburgh back in the early 1900s about whether we had any business sending missionaries over to China to try and convert people to Christianity. The Bohemians were against it, and as it turned out, a few of the Chinese were against it too, to the extent that they killed some of the missionaries, which now a memorial to them in Oberlin, Ohio. Yeah.
When she lived with her lover on Murray Hill, the judge's daughter, she wrote that book in a troll's
Yes,
garden.
it's Troll's Garden, right.
Now, was that about a relationship, or was it about the judge?
Troll's Garden is a series of short stories, and it was one of the books that she dedicated to Isabel explicitly. It's dedicated to her. There's in fact a little poem there. The stories kind of range. I mean, there's several stories in there, and I wouldn't necessarily want to say that they're all about the judge or whatever. Paul's case itself appeared in that collection, as I recall. So yeah, but it definitely written there and obviously inspired by it.
Could you talk to us about City Paper a little bit?
Sure. Pittsburgh's finest weekly publication.
Yeah, I read it all the time. Why do they have such a pornographic section?
Bohemia.
Whatever do you mean? Well, oh, Dan Savage, yeah. Well, we could have an interesting debate about Dan Savage as Bohemia versus, and clearly, I will say this: when City Paper, I think Mike mentioned earlier that I had worked in Pittsburgh for a lot of years, for a couple of years before I worked for City Paper. In Pittsburgh, or City Paper bought out in Pittsburgh back in 1997, and I was already working for City Paper at the time, so you can imagine I felt pretty good about myself. But the message that we got loud and clear when we bought them up, people were calling in unsolicited from us. I was getting emails, I was getting phone calls. The most popular feature by far in Pittsburgh was Savage Love. And I realize it's an acquired taste. Look, I have to edit that thing. I have to proofread that thing. And some of it makes, and believe me, it needs some proofreading. And some of it shocks me a little bit. I grew up a Presbyterian. I'm just a nice kid from the South Hills. I never even heard of half that stuff. So I understand where people sometimes are made uncomfortable by it. But I also have to say, I think some of the writing in there, and this is again, you and I might have a difference of opinion on this, I think it's some of the funniest, smartest, most thought-provoking in many ways stuff that's in the paper. He's better than me a lot of times, more often than I would probably care to admit to you. You know, beyond that, I can't really say. It's definitely, you know, I wouldn't leave it around for the grandkids to read, you know, certainly, but it is a tremendously popular feature, and I believe in it myself because I think actually Savage, if you really started, we could have a whole other hour-long conversation about that Savage. I think that guy's one of the smartest people writing in America.
How old is he?
Ooh, he's a few years older than me. You know, interestingly, you talk about, huh?
So he's 23.
No, I'm 36. Thank you very much. 36 with a 50-year-old guy's hair.
Is he married?
Interestingly, he is in a committed relationship with he's gay. A committed relationship with a male partner, as you would have to be if you wanted to be gay. And they're raising a child together. He's written a book about that as well. And as you know, as far as anyone can tell, they're devoted and loving parents.
In Pittsburgh.
Oh no, he lives. I should explain that column is syndicated. He's also the editor of kind of the equivalent to City Paper in Seattle, which is called The Stranger. And that column is basically syndicated in most of the markets, most of the alt weeklies in the country now. Yep.
Whatever happened to Andy Newman?
Oh yes. Well, speaking of creative geniuses having to leave Pittsburgh to pursue their dreams, Andy lives in New York City in the I think the Lower East Side now, and he does some freelancing for the New York Times. You have to be careful. There are two Andy Newmans writing for the New York Times. Andy Newman is not our Andy Newman. Our Andy Newman is Andrew Adam Newman. He has to, because he was the second guy there, so he has to use the pretentious middle name. Apparently, that's how it works out there.
And Meadville can't be all that bad since Sharon Stone is from there.
Actually, I hate to correct you. Sharon Stone actually grew up in Sagertown. And if you get those confused, people in Meadville get ticked off. You know, it's funny. Sharon was when I was in school there. You know, Sharon was just making it big. That was when what was that movie?
Basic Instinct.
Basic Instinct. Thank you. Basic Instinct came out, and all of a sudden, you know, before she'd been like the beauty queen of Crawford County, as you can well imagine. And her mom apparently was constantly like pimping her to get her into the paper, the Meadville Tribune. And then, guess what? When she made it big, Sharon, suddenly she didn't have time to give interviews to the Meadville Tribune. And they just went on this jihad, this editorial jihad about what a horrible person she was, and how they knew her back when she was working at the LB's Big Boy out on Route 6, and she wasn't any too damn special, and she had plenty of time for him back then. It really got kind of unpleasant, actually. Yes?
Getting back to Willa Cather,
Uh-huh.
did I hear correctly? You said she had a brother who came here to go to school?
Yeah, I can't remember which one. She had several brothers, and he came to a technical college which no longer exists, I'm afraid.
Oh,
But yeah, he came.
because I was going to ask which school.
Yeah, sorry, I'm blanking on the name, and it doesn't. Yeah, it was a technical college. Is that about it?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry if I
I want to tell, give me a couple minutes. I want to tell you a funny story. There were few subjects that I've tried for the last 3 or 4 years to get for you all, and have not been successful. One of them was Willa Cather. I had never been able to find a speaker to talk about her, and lo and behold, 2 days ago we found out that that's what Chris was going to talk about. And so now all we have to do is find someone to talk about Gene Kelly. Was one of the other ones on the list. I grew up out west, and Willa Cather, later in life, when she lived in New Mexico, was really the quintessential Western writer. And she wrote a book called Death Comes to the Archbishop. And I once was when I was in high school, I was in Santa Fe. Many of you have been to the Palace of the Governors in the Central Square in Santa Fe. And someone had adapted that and created a play. It was holiday time in the spring. And in the theater of the Palace of Governors, they presented Cather's Death Comes to the Archbishop. So I certainly remembered her as a writer, and I found tonight fascinating. And I think thank you very much for all the work you obviously did on it.
I'm going across the street to the Squirrel Cafe after this.
We're going to break up now. Please sign the attendance list. We want to do some mailings. feel free to join as a member, and if you join between now and December, you will be a member throughout the year. We have Ellen Roth coming in October for a very different kind of a speech, and I think you'll find our program this year